Good morning, Morai Rabotai. We are continuing on Mesechet Avodah Zarah, and we are on Daf Nun Bet, Amud Aleph, 17 lines up from the bottom of the Amud. Today's Amud is being learned. L'schut Rufa Shel Mav, Rachel Simcha Bat Nahid. I should have full Rufa Shelema, and Be'ezrat Hashem, Amen. And for the Hatzlacha and Rufa Shelema of Yigal ben Abraham and his entire family, Sarah bat Noraz, Rufa Shelema, and so on. Be'ezrat Hashem should have Yeshuot v'nechamot. So we have a Gemara that we started, and now the Gemara is going to ask a very interesting question about fixing a vessel that was used for Avodah Zarah. Imagine if you have a vessel that you use for the sorech of Avodah Zarah, of the idol worship, and now it got a hole in the middle. Now it got a hole in the middle. The Gemara is going to discuss why we're even asking this question versus just a simple building of a new vessel for Avodah Zarah. The Gemara says, let's imagine you had this destroyed keli because it has a large hole in the middle, and now it's not fit for what it was doing before, and you fixed it. You took a hammer and you banged around the hole enough that it thinned out the metal of the surrounding area to the hole, enough that it closed up the hole, and now it could be used for whatever it was carrying before, whatever it was doing before. Does that affect the status of the kli or not? So let's learn. Ba'i Rab Hamnuna. Ritech kli la'avodat kochavim mahu. If you banged and thinned out the hole that was there, and now you covered it by thinning the metal around the area that the hole was there, mahu avodat kochavim deman. Does this become asur because now you built a kli for Avodah Zarah? Or does it not become asur by mere fixing the kli until you serve the Avodah Zarah with it? That's the question of the Gemara. Gemara says, wait a second. What exactly is the scenario? Is this an Avodah Zarah, a kli that's used for Avodah Zarah of a Jew? Or is it a kli that's used for Avodah Zarah for a goy? Because we are now, this is the 2.0 of the Machloket, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael that we discuss. We mentioned that Rabbi Ishmael holds an Avodah Zarah of a Jew becomes asur immediately upon crafting it. Whereas Avodah Zarah of a goy, it becomes asur only if he serves it. And Rabbi Akiva holds exactly the opposite. That by a goy, upon crafting and completing the building of the Avodah Zarah, it's already asur. And for a Jew, it only becomes asur when he actually serves it. That's the machloket that we had. Now, we're not talking about the Avodah Zarah, the statue of the deity itself. We're talking about vessels that are used for the Avodah Zarah. But nevertheless, the Gemara says, whose shita are we following? Says the Gemara, if we are talking about a vessel that's used for Avodat Kochavim Avegoy, so the Gemara says that's not a question at all. Because whether you follow Rabbi Ishmael or Rabbi Akiva, it will be mutar until you serve the Avodah Zarah with this vessel. That's a non-question. Ben Rabbi Akiva, ben Rabbi Ishmael, ben Rabbi Akiva, Meshameshe Avodat Kochavim hen. This is not the Avodah Zarah itself. It's not the statue itself. We're talking about a kli that's used for Avodah Zarah, and that we had a pasuk about it. You remember? We mentioned that Abed ta'bedun et kol hamekomot asher avdu sham hagoyim et Elohehem. That mekomot is not needed for the pasuk. When it says destroy all the places that of the Avodah Zarah serve the Avodah Zarah, it's not talking about destroying the land, because land doesn't become asur. And the Gemara Darshin on the bottom of the Amud that we are talking about vessels that are used for Avodah Zarah. Kelim of Avodah Zarah. You remember? So therefore, the Gemara said earlier, that pasuk says, Asher avdu sham hagoyim et Elohehem. That vessels of Avodah Zarah of Goyim do not become asur behana'ah until they actually use the vessel for the service of Avodah Zarah. Mere designation does not do anything. Right? That's the drasha from the pasuk. And that is universal. Both according to Rabbi Ishmael and according to Rabbi Akiva, when I'm not talking about the actual statue of Avodah Zarah, but yet I'm talking about the keli that's used for Avodah Zarah, that keli does not become asur until I actually serve the Avodah Zarah with it. That's universal. So therefore, we cannot have a question about a vessels of an Avodah Zarah of a goy. So that's out of the picture, because that would not be a question. So what that you banged and you covered the hole? You haven't done anything with the kli, and hence will be mutar. That's a non-question. So therefore, says the Gemara, we're talking about a vessel of an Avodah Zarah of a Jew. Now what's the question? Says the Gemara, Ali Badaman. Now let's determine who is this a question according to. Is it according to Rabbi Ishmael or is it according to Rabbi Akiva? According to Rabbi Akiva is not the question. Because again, what does Rabbi Akiva hold? That a Jew, even the Avodah Zarah itself, even the statue itself does not become asur until you serve it. So is it a question that the vessel would be mutar until you serve it? Of course. It's not a question even. That does not become asur until you actually use the vessel. Because hare, even the statue itself, even the Avodah Zarah itself, which is much more chamur, is not going to become asur until you actually do the avodah. And therefore it's pashut that the kli that is one notch down does not become asur until you do the avodah. So says the Gemara hashta, he gufat, Avodah Zarah itself, lo mitzvah, does not become asur until it is served. Mesha mibaya. The vessels of it is a question. Of course they don't become asur until you use them. By mere banging and covering the hole does not be a designation to the Avodah Zarah does not become asur. It's pashut. So what's the question? It says the Gemara, the question is Ali Rabbi Ishmael. According to Rabbi Ishmael, what does Rabbi Ishmael hold? Rabbi Ishmael holds a goy that builds Avodah Zarah, it does not become asur until you serve it. A Jew that makes Avodah Zarah becomes asur immediately upon crafting it. Now we have a question. Does that same halacha apply to the vessels of Avodah Zarah also? That as soon as I crafted and completed the kli, and it's designated for Avodah Zarah, then it should be asur for usage and asur b'hana'ah? Or maybe the keli of Avodah Zarah is a notch down, and even though that according to him, according to Rabbi Ishmael, an Avodah Zarah of a Jew becomes asur upon crafting and completion, maybe the vessels used for it still don't become asur until I actually use this for the service of Avodah Zarah. That's the question. The Amar, Rabbi Ishmael holds, Asura miyad, the Avodah Zarah of a Yid is asur immediately upon crafting it and completing it. Then what's happening with the halacha about the kelim, the vessels you use for Avodah Zarah? Meshameshin gamrinan. Do we learn the kelim used for Avodah Zarah of a Jew from the kelim that are used for Avodah Zarah of a goy? And therefore, just like by Avodah Zarah of a goy, the kelim, the vessels, do not become asur b'hana'ah until you use them actually in service of the Avodah Zarah. So too, a Jew also, his kelim, his vessels that he uses for Avodah Zarah, should not become asur until you actually serve the Avodah Zarah with it. Even though that the Avodah Zarah itself that the Jew crafts becomes asur immediately, even before you bow to it. Or maybe, no.
Are we speaking of a vessel that was served in Avodah Zarah before used, and then it broke, and then now it's being...
We're going to get to that in a second.
Okay.
Just like by goyim, the vessels don't become asur until you use them. Here also, they should not become asur until you use them. Or dilma, or maybe, no, minah gamar. Maybe we should learn it from the Avodah Zarah itself. In other words, Jews and anything associated with Jews doing Avodah Zarah, it has its own category. We don't learn it from the goyim. And therefore, just like the Avodah Zarah itself of a Jew becomes an Avodah Zarah, becomes, according to Rabbi Ishmael, immediately when you craft it, even before anybody serves it. A keli, a vessel also, once you craft the kli, even before you used it as a service of Avodah Zarah, it should become asur. That's the question of the Gemara. So minah gamar, mahi asura, miyad af meshamesha asurin miyad. Just like it itself, the Avodah Zarah itself, is asur immediately upon crafting and completion. Here also the kelim should be asur. So the Gemara asks the obvious question. Wait a second. You're hawking a chinik, you're asking this question about like a kli that has a hole and then you bang it and cover the hole. Just ask about crafting a new kli. Why do I care about a tum'ah of a keli or the isura hana'ah of a kli that had a hole and now you designated to Avodah Zarah upon completing the fix of the hole? Just talk to me about crafting a new vessel for Avodah Zarah, right? My area, the kami bayale ritech. Why is it that the Gemara chooses to talk about the case of ritech, that they fixed the hole by banging thin the area around the hole? Tibaile asa. You should ask a question for crafting a brand new kli for Avodah Zarah. So says the Gemara, no. It's more complicated than you think. Here we're not just talking about Isur Hana'ah over here. Here we're talking about the Isur of Tum'ah. In other words, Chazal made a Tum'ah on, well, the Avodah Zarah is Tameh. Just like Sheres, just like Met, a corpse, Avodah Zarah and its Meshameshim, Tashmisha Avodah Zarah, they are tameh. They really have a tumah. If you touch something to it, they become tameh. Now, how do you rid yourself of this tumah that a kli of a meshamesha Avodah Zarah have? So it says the Gemara, Rav Hamnuna mishum tumah yeshana kami bayale. Rav Hamnuna is asking for a tumah yeshana, for an old tumah. How so? What's the question? Ditnan, as we learn in a Mishnah, the Mishnah says regarding, this is a Mishnah in Mesechet Kelim, regarding a regular tum'ah, nothing to do with Avodah Zarah. The halachot of tum'ah v'tahara includes and entails the following Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Kelim matechot, if you have a metal vessel, if you have a kli matechet that does not have any area to accept something in it, it's not a vessel that contains items, it's just a knife, whatever it is, it's a vessel that does not have a kli kibul, it's not, or a vessel that has a container component to it, that it is a spoon, a bowl, a plate. Temein, they are mekabele tum'ah. They are susceptible to tum'ah. This is keli matechot, right? Matechet, a metal is mekabel tum'ah, even if it's pshute kelim. That means it's a kli, it's a vessel crafted, made, even though that it doesn't have a container component. So says the Gemara, nishtaberu taharu. If you break them, if they broke to pieces, now that tum'ah goes away. Even though they didn't dip it in the mikveh, nothing. You broke, You remember we discussed this when we discussed the sugya in Baba Metzia Daf Nuntet Amud Aleph, the famous story of Tanur Shel Achnai, which was the background story of Rabbi Eliezer Agadol, the Rebbe of Rabbi Akiva, being put into excommunication and cherem because his argument that he did not accept the words of his peers, even though that they were the majority, after the whole discussion was settled, he was put into cherem because of that, right? And what was the question? The question was, you have a tanur, you have an oven, and the oven, it's made out of clay, and when a kli cheres becomes tameh, en lo takana olamit, it does not have any fix. Ishaber, you have to break it. So said Rabbi Eliezer Agadol, no problem, it's awesome. I break it and the tumah goes away. But I break it with a chainsaw. I slice it to rings, right? And now it's tahor or tameh? Tahor. And then I reconstruct it. And now you have a brand new-ish kli cheres, tanur, and it's tahor. Chachamim disagreed. They said, no, it goes back. That was the whole machloket, right? But here is a mishnah. There's nobody argues with this. The kli matechet that broke becomes now the tumah goes away. So says the Gemara, if you go back and you fix it, chazar v'asan kelim yachzeru letumah. They go back to their tumah. So says the Gemara, letumah yeshana, to their old tumah that they had. And this is the question of Rab Hamnuna. Rab Hamnuna is coming off of this Mishnah in Mesechet Kelim that we just discussed. And his question is, Ki hadra tum'ah hanimiri le tum'ah deoraita. When the Mishnah says that a vessel that was tameh was broken and the tum'ah went away and now it was reconstructed and the tum'ah comes back, is that only talking about the tum'ah deoraita? A biblical level of tum'ah, aval tum'ah de rabbanan lo. But if you have a tum'ah that the whole tum'ah is the rabbanan, for instance, if a keli touches mashkin, midoraita, mashkin do not metame kelim. Liquids, they cannot pass tum'ah to vessels, right? That is a tum'ah de rabbanan that exists. So it says, the Gemara, that's what the Rabbi Hamnuna is asking. If you have the Rabbanan level of Tum'ah on this Kli, and now the Kli broke, and now you reconstructed it, maybe you should not come back. Because that Mishnah in Kelim that says the Tum'ah comes back is only on a severe biblical level of Tum'ah, but maybe not the Rabbanan. The whole thing is the Rabbanan. So maybe Chachamim were Mekil and say, if the Tum'ah at some point went away, it does not come back. Or maybe not. Maybe called the takun rabbanan ke'en deoraita tikun. Maybe every tikun of Chachamim was constructed and structured after the pattern of the Torah, and hence it should be following the same rule. That I don't care if it's a tum'ah rabbanan, a level but which is much lower of tum'ah. If you break it and you reconstruct it, it comes back, even though that's a tum'ah rabbanan. That's the question. So says the Gemara. Odil ma'alo shena. V'tibai le'sha'ar tumot. So wait a second. The Gemara says, so why do you ask me about a tum'ah v'kli, which is a tum'ah because of Mesechet Avodah Zarah? Just tell me tum'ah rabbanan and call it a day. Keep things simple. Just ask me about all the tum'ah rabbanans. Why do you pick this like scenario of a kli that has a whole? Why do you have to do that? Which is also a tum'ah rabbanan. Says the Gemara, no. Chada migo chada kami bayale. It's a compound question, which has two levels of asking that question, and it's like this: Tum'ah rabbanan mi hadra or lo hadra. First level of question is: does this Mishnah in Kelim that the tum'ah goes back when you reconstruct the kli? Does that apply to Tum'ah Rabbanan also or not? Maybe it doesn't. And even if you tell me it doesn't, in the case of the Rabbanan, then maybe Tum'ah Avodat Kochavim Mishum Chumra Avodat Kochavim Mishavyo Rabbanan Ketum'ah Deoraita Olo. Maybe here is worse, because we're talking about Avodat Kochavim is the most severe case of Tum'ah that you have. It's Avodah Zarah. So maybe because of the chomer of Avodah Zarah, because of the severity of the Yisur Avodah Zarah, Chazal made an extra extension, and in this one specific case, they extended the Tum'ah and they made it equivalent of a Tum'ah Deoraita, and that's the question that Rab Hamnuna is asking. It's a compounded question. So says the Gemara, Teiku, we don't know. It's a good question, right? Tishbi Taras, you see why we need Mashiach, right? Well, that's why we need Tishbi Taras Kushud V'Avayat. So says the Gemara, Ba'imine, another question. Rabbi Yochanan, Mi Rabbi Yanai. Tikrovet Avodat Kochavim Shel Ochalim Mahu. What is the halacha, asks Rabbi Yochanan from Rabbi Yanai, of Tikrovet Avodat Kochavim, that's something that you offered to Avodat Kochavim, which is food items. Are we talking about the Tum'ah? The Tum'ah that they have, once we're talking about the Tum'ah of a vessel used for Avodah Zarah, how about Tikrovet Avodah Zarah? Not vessels used for Avodah Zarah, but an offering that you brought to Avodah Zarah. You remember, offering has a different halacha, right? Sometimes it could even be worse than the Avodah Zarah itself. You could be mebatel the Avodah Zarah. You can't necessarily be mebatel the Tikrovet Avodah Zarah, the offering to the Avodah Zarah. Now imagine the offering is a food item. And now it has the Isur Hana'ah and it has the Tum'ah. But let's talk about the Tum'ah. Can I get rid of that Tum'ah that this item has because it became Tikrovet Avodah Zarah? That's the question of Rabbi Yochanan to Rabbi Yanai. Can you get rid of it or not? V'tibai lekelim says, wait a second, why do you have to ask me about food items that are made Tikrovet Avodah Zarah? Ask me for the kelim, the vessels. So says the Gemara, no, kelim lo kami bayale. He doesn't have a question on kelim. Why? Because kevan deitlu tara b'mikveh. Once they have a modality, a way to be tahor, to become tahor with putting them in the mikveh. The kelim you could dip in the mikveh and the tumah goes away, right? Again, we're not talking about the isur of hana'ah that a keli has. We're not talking about that. But a keli, the regular keli that becomes tameh, you dip it in the mikveh, it becomes tahor. So therefore, once you have a way to get rid of the tum'ah, this also is like tevilah, mikveh. Bitul of that thing is like, bitul of Avodah Zarah is like mikveh. That when you mebattle, when you denounce the Avodah Zarah or the keli, the meshabesh Avodah Zarah, that denunciation is equivalent of mikveh. And he gets rid of the tum'ah. That's why Rabbi Yochanan doesn't have a question about vessels. But food, you don't dip the food in the mikveh. There's no such a thing as taking food in the mikveh. And therefore, it's a question. So, says the Gemara, the question is on food because you cannot dip them in the mikveh. Says the Gemara, another question. Why don't you ask this about Avodat Kochavim itself, the actual idol, the actual statue? Says the Gemara, Avodat Kochavim gufa lo mibayale. He also doesn't have a question on Avodah Zarah itself. Kevad the isurah batil tumata nami betela. Once the source of the tum'ah is the isur of Avodat Kochavim, and you could knock out the source, like uproot the whole thing from the roots, and completely make it mutar. A goy could denounce Avodah Zarah, and the whole isur goes away. And once you could do that, the tum'ah also goes away with it, because you uprooted the whole thing from the source. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't have a question on that either. The question is, now we go back to why we talked about a food that was offering to Avodah Zarah. It says, the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan only is asking in a sliver of a case of offerings of Avodah Zarah. Because we mentioned before, offerings of Avodah Zarah, can you nullify them? Nope. We learned it from a pasuk. That in that sense is worse than the Avodah Zarah itself. Something that was offered to the Avodah Zarah, that tikrovet you cannot get rid of. The Isur Hana'ah. And therefore, the Tum'ah of the tikrovet Avodat Kochavim, which is food item. Because you cannot uproot the actual Isur of tikrovet Avodah, because it's tikrovet Avodah Zarah. Can you get rid of the Tum'ah separate from the Isur Hana'ah when you can't even dip it in the mikveh? So you see, it's very specific. Every other case around it is really not a question. It's only a question in this specific case with two components. A, it's not a Avodah Zarah itself or a Keli Meshamesh. It's a Tikrovet Avodah Zarah. It's an offering to Avodah Zarah which you can't get rid of the Isur Hana'ah. And B, it is also an ochel, and food item, which doesn't have any fix for its tum'ah by dipping it in the mikveh. So says the Gemara, Kedorav Gidel, tum'ah nami lo batla. Therefore, just like the isur you can't get rid of, like Rav Gidel explained, the tum'ah also you can't get rid of. Or dilma, or maybe Isur deoraita lo batil. The Isur hana'ah of a tikrovet Avodah Zarah is Isur deoraita, and therefore you cannot nullify and get rid of the Isur. But Tum'ah darabanan, but the Tum'ah which is only a Gezerah darabanan, it is much more lenient, and maybe you could get rid of it. Tum'ah darabanan batil. And again, the Gemara says, it's a good question, teku. So as much as we know about Avodah Zarah, there are many cases that, in those cases, the Amoraim themselves throw their hands up, and the next question of the Gemara, Be'ezrat Hashem, will continue in the days to come.